Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 218. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Marcia Menter about her new book titled That Voice, In Search of Ann Drummond-Grant, the singer who shaped my life. That Voice is part biography and part memoir. It details the life of Scottish contralto Ann Drummond-Grant, known as Drummie, who died during the prime of her career in 1959. Drummie sang lead roles for the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, a famous Gilbert and Sullivan troupe that toured Great Britain for over 100 years. Years after Drummie's death, Marcia was a young teen in upstate New York when she discovered Drummie's legendary singing voice. That discovery impacted Marcia so profoundly that she spent years learning, or as she puts it, failing to learn, how to sing. That Voice details Drummie's life, as well as Marcia's own journey to try to capture some of Drummie's musical magic for herself. In this episode, I'll chat with Marcia about her writing journey, why Drummie's position with the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company was so coveted, and what Marcia says is her greatest gift as a writer, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Marcia Menter, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your brand new book, That Voice, In Search of Ann Drummond-Grant, the singer who shaped my life. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, it's an odd book. It's a hybrid of a memoir, mine, and a biography, hers, because this was someone who literally shaped my life, even though it turned out she died before I knew she existed. But she was a singer. She had an extraordinary voice. And I encountered her through recordings when I was an adolescent, about 13, in Syracuse, New York, where it always snows. And this voice was so extraordinary that it started me on a path of wanting to become a singer. And I did, in fact, ultimately get a degree from a music conservatory, in singing, which I then promptly didn't use because I didn't succeed at becoming a singer on any level. So it's a story of failing to learn to sing. And it's a story of her life where she absolutely succeeded to learn to sing. And she was British, she was Scottish, she was born in Edinburgh. And she sang with the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, which was the Gilbert and Sullivan troupe for many years. It was the only professional troupe because they held the copyrights. Mr. D'Oyly Carte originally was the impresario who brought Gilbert and Sullivan together. So this company was world famous, and she sang with them for many years, but she died pretty young.
Tell us a little bit about Ann Drummond-Grant. I'd like to start with what made her so unique out of all the singers in all the world. Like, what was so unique about her that it captured your attention?
Well, she was unique vocally, but before I knew she was unique vocally, she had a quality, and I think many people have had this experience with an artist. You hear an artist, you see an artist, you read the artist's work, and it seems to be communicating directly with you. It's like that person is there in the room with you, and you feel, I want to say, the energy. You feel the person, the living person. So this was her effect on me. She was, I had I'm not a kind of an ordinary, misunderstood adolescence, right? I had a mother who was not motherly in many ways. And I was introverted and lonely and shy. And this is a story that many people can tell. And I heard this voice, and this voice was a friend. I mean, literally a friend. And she was singing Gilbert and Sullivan, which I had never heard. And, as an American kid, I thought this stuff was like the meat of the elite, it was very highbrow. Now, if I'd been in England, the British think it's a very middle brow, but I became just enchanted with her voice. I learned everything I could by listening and listening to all these recordings of Gilbert and Sullivan. And then I went on to love other kinds of classical music and to play the piano and to study singing. So this was the start that I got. Now, she was extraordinary as a singer because she had an exceptional voice. It started out as a large soprano voice. It settled into a deeper register as a mezzo soprano. And then she could sing soprano roles, mezzo soprano roles, and ultimately contralto roles. Those are the roles I heard her singing. So it was an extraordinary voice. She was an extraordinary person who was difficult to get to know because she was very dignified. And because of events in her life, I think she was not one of these people who talks a lot about her life. So it was a process of uncovering through the public record who she was and where she came from and what happened to her. So this took me many years, but I did it for love. I wasn't even planning to write the book at that point. I was just obsessed with her. And then there was an internet, and there was a whole community of Gilbert and Sullivan people, and I could find out more, and I could talk to people who'd worked with her, and it became a real project. And then there became a point in my life when I thought, if I do not write this book, I will regret it. There are many other writing projects that you know you can do. I made my living as a writer and editor, and there are things that you're perfectly happy not to have to write. But this book, I would have been upset with myself if I hadn't written it.
Well, in all that research, those years worth of research, was there anything about Anne that surprised you, that maybe seemed out of character?
Well, first of all, nobody ever called her Anne. Her given name was Annie. She was named after her grandmother. And this was not an Annie. This was a very dignified person, and she was entering a very dignified field. So she was always called Drummie, as in Drummond-Grant. Mm-hmm. And she started out in life in a working class home. Clearly, she sang from the time she was a young girl, but she had family happenings that kept her from being able to go out and sing. Her mother died when she was very young. She wound up having to live with her sister and take care of her father for years. And then when she went out into the world, it was still difficult for her. She, not as a singer, because she always was admired for that, but she had some personal setbacks, which she overcame. And these were all fascinating to learn about. But by the time she was singing the roles that I heard, she was already kind of a grande dame, in the company.
Well, let's talk about the company, because for people who aren't familiar with it,
the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, which closed down in 1982, so it was in existence for over 100 years. I think it was started around 1878. This was these people. It was a touring company. They were on the road with these operas, of which there were originally 14, but they toured with 10 or 12 of them. They were on the road 48 weeks a year, mostly in England and Scotland and Wales, but also in the US and Canada sometimes. And it was the only theatrical institution where you had a job, you had a steady paycheck. It wasn't enormous. You had to pay for your own transportation and even your own makeup, but this was the only place where you had guaranteed work. And it became really a family, and it had to be because you had these operas. The operas had roles. If somebody was sick, someone else had to be ready to step into that role, like a well-oiled machine. The costume departments, everything was pretty top-notch. But it's astonishing to me that it lasted that long.
Mm.
And it was very, very well known in England because it toured everywhere.
Yeah. Is there anything comparable today that
I don't think so. No.
no?
If she were singing today, well, she had a different temperament and was a different person, but she had a voice that could have sung grand opera. She could have been singing Verdi in houses all over Europe, or because she was a British soprano, she could have been singing all the leader and oratorio roles that these singers, the famous singers, often sang. But she wanted to be on the stage, and I think she wanted the security of this touring company. And also, she met this man that she married, who was the musical director of the company, and she wanted to tour with him. And she couldn't for a long time because when she met him, he was married to somebody else, and the company was so afraid that it would cause a scandal that they asked her to leave, which was catastrophic for her because she had no money. So it's quite a story, and I was able to put it together from public records and from a little bit of gossip and from just seeing what happened.
Mm-hmm. Put into context also for us these operas that they were touring with. Again, is there anything comparable today that's out there?
Gilbert and Sullivan is the ancestor of the American musical.
Mm-hmm.
All of the great lyricists on Broadway, from Hammerstein to Lin-Manuel Miranda, admired Gilbert and were trying to outdo him in some way. He was, Gilbert's lyrics were clever and perfect. Well, not always perfect, but they were damn good. And Sullivan's music was astonishingly good. This man was supposed to be the great British composer, but he was happy writing these lighter musical entertainments, which contained brilliant parodies of Mendelssohn, Wagner. He was a very, very good composer. And when you put the two of them together, you get works of satire, but also beautiful music that lasts. I mean, it's good. And when I was listening to them as a kid, I missed a lot of the satire. I didn't know what they were satirizing.
Right.
In HMS Pinafore, which was their first mega hit, they were satirizing the first Lord of the Admiralty and the British Navy and all this stuff. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I was enchanted by it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there was something appealing even to the 13-year-old girl.
When a work is good,
Yeah.
it's good on many levels, and an audience can understand it on many levels. And this is true of any art form, I think. If it's good, there's something for the reader or listener to get. So Gilbert and Sullivan, if you watched, there was a Simpsons episode where Sideshow Bob, the villain, was singing HMS Pinafore. I don't need to describe the whole thing, but he was the effete snob, and Pinafore was supposed to be snobbish, which it really isn't at all. It's entertainment and it's lots of fun still. And there are still companies, amateur companies, almost exclusively, that perform Gilbert and Sullivan and have a wonderful time doing it. But they're not a touring professional theater company. You do see sometimes opera companies performing some of the operas, but not so often.
So how did you let's talk about your journey then. So how did you make your way from the 13-year-old girl listening to Drummie on those recordings to writing this book? You had a singing career, but let's talk about that singing career and then your transition into writing.
I had absolutely no singing career. I had a whole bunch of singing teachers from whom I never managed to learn the basics of breath support. I talk a lot in the book about the physical art of singing, and I talk about it in a way that's accessible to the reader. I don't get super technical about it. But there is a way to sing properly, by which I mean, a singer is doing, I mean, the singers today, even on Broadway, they're all mic'd, right? But the singing that I'm talking about was singing for an audience with my naked, natural voice and being able to be heard by the audience, to project, to have from the top to the bottom of the voice, to have everything seamless with not a lot of bumps and breaks. This is the basics of good singing. And even a pop singer, if they're not doing it right, their career doesn't last. They start having to have surgery for polyps or something going on the vocal cords. You need to know what you're doing with singing. And I never learned that until I was in my 30s, and I went back, and there was finally a teacher who taught me the basics, and I was grateful for that. But singing never brought me much pleasure, and I knew when I graduated from music school that there was no way I was going to try to make a living from it. So I just turned around and somehow, they used to call it the left-handed life. It's not the stuff you go to school for, it's the stuff you sort of do on the side. And I could always write. I always wrote. I scribbled into a notebook, kept journals my whole youth. So the book, the journals were the source of a lot of this book. People say, how did you remember all that? I remembered it because I wrote it down. And then I had a series of jobs where I was paid to write. I went into public relations and started writing press releases. And I had a job at an agency that handled magazines, and I went over to the editorial side, which is very unusual. And I started writing fashion and beauty copy, which is similar to the skills you use writing poems. It's another topic of conversation. I think you learn to write. First, you need a talent for it. Then you need to write. And then you need to be edited. And you need to be open to being edited, And then you learn what good writing is and what your good writing is, because it's about your voice, but writing is about the reader. So I worked in magazines for many years, and that was my education in learning to write for a reader. You're always, no matter what you're writing, the first draft is for you and everything else is for the reader. It's like, what have you written? Is it clear? Does it make any sense? Is there anything obscure about it? This is the craft of writing that I was privileged to learn in magazines.
Trial by fire, it sounds like.
Well, I had good editors, and then I became an editor, and I had a talent for it, and I liked doing it. So you kind of have to have that talent, but you also have to be willing to make it a craft. And this is true of anything. It starts out with a talent, and then it becomes a craft. And if you don't have the talent and the craft, you don't have anything really.
So that experience of working, say, for the magazine and being edited and learning the craft of writing sounds like it was a different and possibly more enjoyable experience than your experience learning to sing.
Well, I mean, I could sit down at the piano and learn to play a piece and play it well, but I could not do that with singing because I didn't have the basics of vocal technique. Eventually, I did acquire the basics of vocal technique, by which time I was earning my living as a writer. And I also began to understand temperamentally, I don't really want to stand up in front of people and sing. When I went to music school, all the singers they were in love with singing, and their answering machines on their phones were, hello, they never missed an opportunity to sing a snatch of music. And I was not like that. And I had to realize, I had to learn, this is not my temperament. And half of life is learning what your own temperament is, I think.
Yes. And I want to go back to another point on the heels of that. I want to go back to another point you made where that translates into writing. So you mentioned that you needed to learn to write well, but also, learn what good writing is, but also learn what good writing is for you.
Yes.
So your temperament in writing, your voice in writing, and how to make that the best it can be. That's an interesting concept for people who aren't necessarily writers, or even for some writers, understanding your own voice and making it good.
You will see from if you read my book, which I advise, you will see that I tend to write declarative sentences. I vary the length of the sentence. I mean, you're going to the craft at the level of what is the reader seeing and hearing, and are you carried at all by the rhythm of the prose? And that's down to the level of the sentence. And you have to become aware of your own preferred form of sentence. Mine is very direct. Other people are not, because I'm that kind of communicator. And I when I've also I hate to say I'm a poet, because that's like I'm never going to eat again. But poems, to me, every word counts. And if you write a poem, you spend a lot of time putting a word in and taking it out. Oscar Wilde said something about that. He said, I spent the morning putting in a comma and taking it out again. Well, that's kind of a joke, but writing poems is like that. But writing prose is like that too. You're aware of the flow of the words, and is it your voice? And you also, when you're writing a memoir, you have to tell the truth, and you have to put in the stuff that's humiliating, because readers can tell if you're glossing over something. You have to, if you can't be brutally honest with yourself about something, don't write about it, because the reader's going to know that you're fudging the truth. So that's part of the process too in memoir. Memoir is, I've often said it felt exactly like pulling my own teeth writing some of this stuff, but I felt that I had to do that. And indeed, the book is better for it.
Right. It's not an exercise for the faint of heart to write a memoir.
Nothing is. I mean, publishing these days is not an exercise for the faint of heart, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that, because you began your writing career a few years ago, let's say.
Yeah, that's
I'm curious, how different was it
well,
getting started in the industry versus what you see today?
when I worked in magazines, first of all, you had an audience that was measured in millions.
Mm,
Now, what you gain in broadness, breadth, you lose in depth. So if you're writing for millions of people, you're not writing about particle physics. It's that's what starts you thinking about what's clear and direct. But there were millions, or at least hundreds of thousands of people reading your whatever it is, your beauty copy, your fashion copy, I wrote some memoirs, some short essays that were memoirs for Glamour and for a magazine called More that I loved, for women over 40. And there were always readers there, and there was always a response, and you had this ready-made audience, and it made you very kind of, well, I have readers. Now, there are not so many magazines anymore. I don't know if any of the magazines I worked for is still in print. Self is not in print. I'm not sure about Glamour being in print. Red Book is gone. More is gone. Marie Claire's out there. And there was something else. Mademoiselle. I worked at Mademoiselle for a couple of years. They're all gone because the internet basically killed the magazines. And it changed the economics at magazines. So now the people I know who were working at magazines are content creators. They have a completely different set of hurdles to jump. How do they find work? How do they get paid? If you're creating content, when you're writing for a magazine, you're writing in the magazine's voice. But if you're creating content, it's more about advertising. Magazines were about advertising, but not to this extent. So it's a tougher environment. Also, you don't get paid nearly as much. When I was writing fashion copy, I made a lot of money doing it. Now it doesn't happen at mostly. I don't know what they're paying at Vogue, but even Vogue, it's just a very different landscape now.
Looking back from where you started to where you are now, I'm curious if there are things that you as a writer still struggle with. Like, are there things that you still have to work on in your craft?
Well, it's funny. The greatest gift that I always felt I had as a writer was that I was absolutely confident that I could solve the problem on the page, whatever it was. Even when I was writing in magazines, and then when I was editing in magazines, and then when I was editing the editors, you give me a problem, I knew in my bones that I could solve it. And when I sat down to write this book, which is a complicated story of my life braided with her life, braided with all these other things, I knew I could solve this problem. So this was a gift that I had. The things that I struggle with are putting myself out there. It's one thing to sit down and write a book. It's another thing to sell it, market it. Temperamentally, I'm happy writing, and selling is tough, but that's what you have to do.
What do you find to be the best part about being a writer? Is there something that really stands out for you that just you enjoy above all else?
Being good at something. I love
Mhm.
being good at something. When I worked at magazines, I loved being needed because I was good at it. I wasn't, it wasn't like fancy literary, but it had to be good. And the ways that it had to be good, I just liked knowing my craft. It was enormously satisfying to be good at something, even if what you were writing was a story about sunscreen. Okay, that's complicated. And it was a great feeling of, yeah, I can do this.
Now that you've written this book, do you have others in progress? Is there anything you're working on currently?
I need to have a project. I don't have one at the moment because it was difficult to sell this book, and because I've learned enough about the publishing business to know that, to know what a lot of work it is to sell a book once you've written it. And I don't have another book that I'm desperate to write, which also makes this one harder to sell because, what else have you got? I'm happy to have written this one. I have an itch to be doing some more writing, but at this point, I'm not sure what that is, and I'm just going to let it cook and see what happens.
In the back of your mind, do you have other goals for yourself as a writer? I mean, other things you might want to do or try or explore?
Well, at the moment, I want to play Bach.
Oh,
So, I mean, I've gone back to the piano. I bought myself a keyboard so I could play with headphones so that nobody has to hear how terrible it is, because I always enjoyed doing that, and I'm doing that for its own sake. I want to be a better reader and just more comfortable at the keyboard. So that's my project right now, and I don't have to answer to anybody, and I like that very much also.
right. Very good. Congratulations on getting there.
Yeah. Well, I'm
So,
old enough to have gotten there.
well, if people want to learn more about you and the book, That Voice, where can they go to find you and that information?
I have a website, which with the simplest name possible, marciamenter.com. That's MarciaMenter.com. That's really a website for the book. And there's more about me, and there's more about Drummie, and there's also links to buying it, which is mostly Amazon. It has been sold into stores, but I think the quickest, most reliable way to find it is to order it from Amazon.
Good.
And it's also available in the UK, I'm happy to say, because there are a lot of British readers who want it as well.
Right. Excellent. Well, Marcia, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with That Voice and learning Bach. Good luck with that. So, congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the bookshop at the end of the internet.